Okay. Do you see my PowerPoint that says balancing physical and spiritual needs? Okay. So there was one question, which is going to the issue of balancing physical and spiritual needs. I talked about it a little bit last week, but I'm going to go back to this again because these questions keep coming up. And so, for example, looking at this question at the bottom, there are so many poverty-stricken people in this world. They struggle for a living and they can't really choose what they want to do. So how can they fulfill their spiritual needs and build a good operating system when they can't even settle their hunger? Is it possible to build a good operating system without fulfilling basic needs? So actually, I mean, and actually I'll talk about this and more to next week when I'm going to kind of wrap it all up and bring it all together about operating system, everything like that. But a good operating system actually, basically, I think what I'm trying to say is that human beings, they have physical, intellectual, social, and spiritual needs, you can say. And so a good operating system actually needs to allow for all of these. It's actually not only about satisfying these needs, but it's also about developing these abilities. In other words, we have the ability to develop our physical capacities, our ability to physically work with the world and transform the world. We also have the ability to develop our society, to live in society. We have the ability to think intellectually, and we have the ability to understand spiritually. So we have needs for all of these things, but we also have abilities for all of these things. And a good operating system is one that should develop these abilities so that we can meet these needs, right? And a good operating system should not cut off one or the other one of them. So an operating system that's only that in a sense ignores the fact that we are physical beings, who live in a body and who need to feed ourselves and who need to survive. If an operating system ignores that, then there's something wrong with that, right? If an operating system is only looking at our physical existence but not our social existence, that's also a problem. And if an operating is only looking at our physical or social existence and not our spiritual understanding, our spiritual needs, it's also a problem. So really, and that's a bit of the problem in the world today, is that we have multiple operating systems, each of which is only focusing on one aspect of who we are. So in a sense, how do we bring it all together so we can have a holistic kind of operating system that helps to nurture and develop and satisfy the needs of our mind, our body, our mind, and our spirit. And then this is something that really applies. It doesn't matter if you're in a rich society or a poor society. And I mentioned something about this last week. And again, I'll talk about it, that, I've been to, I remember when I was in, I've been to very poor places. I've been to a very poor area of Western Africa. I've also been to a poor area of Pakistan, also in Laos. So in the course of my research and travels, I've traveled to very, very poor places. And, for physical survival, so in places where people are very poor and having to deal with the issue of survival, well, it's actually very hard to survive completely alone. In fact, that's what they know. People who are living in poverty, they know that it's impossible to survive alone. So if you're going to be totally selfish, you really won't get anywhere. So the ability to cooperate, to work together, to help each other is deeply, deeply valued and prized. And so what's amazing is that generosity is actually such a high value in very poor places. It's quite amazing. And the reason for that is that you need to, when you are really, when you're desperate, then you really realize how you rely on other people. And so, learning to rely on other people means that you have to develop, you have to know how to trust other people. And that also means that you have to know how to be trustworthy, that other people will trust you. And so these are actually virtues, these are moral qualities. And we've talked about how these are related to religion and spirituality, and that's one of the reasons why people in very poor countries or poor regions are usually also tend to be very religious. And it's not simply because they're ignorant, it's actually because their religious practices help them to emphasize how to be trustworthy, how to be generous, how to work better with other people, right? How to have collective rituals, so to strengthen the sense of community, so that people are more have more cohesion and more ability to cooperate with each other. So that's why this is something that spirituality and religion, it applies even in the cases of the absolute poverty, but then it also applies in case of absolute wealth, right? So then in very rich societies, then you have the issue that people already have so much money that they don't even know what to do with their money, and then their lives feel very empty. And so then so the Maslow pyramid is actually very biased for rich people. It's like, okay, I devoted myself to making a lot of money, and now, oh, I feel kind of empty. So now what do I want to do? So this is very characteristic of more affluent societies, but actually in poor places, they also, maybe it doesn't work according to Maslow's pyramids, but we still have, in different ways, we have the expression of these spiritual capacities, spiritual needs. Yeah. All right. So that was about balancing physical and spiritual needs. So then there was actually an interesting question here about actually the definition of religion. So you wrote, as the course proceeds, the definition of religion in this course seems to be getting increasingly ambiguous. At the beginning, a religion is introduced as operating systems which enable us to apprehend the higher spiritual world, educating our spiritual nature, bringing it closer to the divine reality and higher level of morality. And in the latest lecture, the axial figures share the same goals: to promote people's self-reflexivity and individual transcendence. Right. So all that is according to how that I had defined religion. But so then you mentioned the problem, though, under this definition, as long as it can provide guidance to their followers on how to attain that higher spiritual reality, philosophical thoughts like Confucianism or Aristotelianism can also be regarded as religion, despite the absence of a central mythology and single moral community. So then you brought in the definition of religion by Durkheim. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But then at the end here, does this mean that the definition of religion is flawed? So what is the key factor in making a religion and not simply a philosophical thought? Actually, before I answer that, anybody of you have any thoughts on that? What's the difference between a religion and simply, a philosophy? Would anybody have any thought on that? A figure to worship. Uh-huh. Any other thoughts?
I guess religion is more powerful than just a philosophical thought. It's more significant, and people tend to rely on beliefs that are from religion than from philosophy, something like that.
Okay, so, all right. So there's something more powerful. Uh-huh. Religion is taught by some divine beings, myth that can't be resolved or comprehended, source of power more superior than human. Right. So actually, I think all of these answers are some aspects. So in a sense, you could say that often religion, actually, usually religion includes philosophy, right? Every religion has philosophy, or has a lot of philosophical thoughts and even philosophical systems and theories, but it's not all, it's more than that. And usually, a philosophy is purely at the abstract intellectual level, right? But it doesn't So it gives us concepts and ideals that you can think about rationally. And so actually it could give us concepts about God, about your soul, about how to grow spiritually. So indeed, like actually Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, actually there are very many very interesting and very valuable kind of spiritual concepts about spirituality in philosophies, and in European philosophy talks a lot about God, actually. But right, but then there's what's missing. Okay, so the idea of figure to worship. Right, so there's not the personal, like engaging yourself personally to directly connect with that divine reality. So you talk about it, you analyze it, you think about it, but then in religion it's not only that, it's like, okay, now you want to have a relationship with it. Okay, so that's actually, for me, I think that's really the key distinction here. Right, and so you have faith, in it. So religions have philosophies, but at the same time most religions also have some idea where, it's like in Taoism, Dao Ke Dao Fei Chang Dao, at the end of the day, it is beyond philosophy, right? There's some things that you just can't really describe. And so you can try to build a whole philosophical system, but at the end of the day, let's be like Zhuangzi and his butterfly dream, right? Right. And the philosophy is not sufficient, right? And so you have faith, and right, you spend time. That's a good point, right? So you devote yourself to it. So you actually change your life. It's not just ideas. Right, there are aspects that can't be resolved or comprehended. Right, not only the idea that it's taught by divine beings, but as I said, or as actually, Yoi Chit said, right, it comes from divine beings, and you try to connect through to the divine beings. The idea that then it has a source of power that's superior than human. Right. So these are all some of the differences between philosophy and religion. And so, yeah, and so then this brings the question of Confucianism and Taoism. Because actually in China, often something like Confucianism is not really considered to be a religion. So one of you asked, in previous lessons, we learned about Taoism and Confucianism. Confucius challenged conventional morality. He criticized many of the rituals and customs of his day that were based on self-interest, not concerning life after death. So why is Confucianism a religious tradition despite its lack of concern for the afterlife? As to my understanding, religious beliefs tend to have our mindset on people's afterlife. So there's one thing about Confucianism that actually there's endless debates as to whether Confucianism is religion or not. And in modern times, most people think that Confucianism is not a religion, but I think that you would say differently if you were actually living in the Qing dynasty or earlier, right? Because actually before modern times, under Confucianism, you had to, Confucian, when he talks about Li, he talked about rituals, and these rituals were for venerating heaven, right? So, Ji Tian, Bai Tian, and so on. So you're doing worship, you're doing ritual, and also not concerned for the afterlife, and yet worshiping ancestors, right? Honoring the ancestors, an important part of Confucian ritual. So, Confucian said, don't spend all your time speculating and spend too much time thinking all the time about the afterlife. He said, stay away from the ghosts and everything like that. But actually, he didn't say they don't exist. He just said, focus on the world here. But he certainly said you have to honor in Confucian tradition, you have to honor your ancestors, you have to honor heaven, you have to have rituals and all of this. But nowadays in modern China, those rituals have been abolished. Generally speaking, they don't exist anymore. And many modern Chinese intellectuals, they want to clean out the religious part of Confucianism. So the way you learn about Confucianism, you learn that it has nothing to do with religion. But I think that's a modern kind of reinterpretation of Confucianism. Anyway, scholars will debate for ages endlessly about this. And ultimately, I think it doesn't really matter that much. If you want it to be religion, fine. If you don't want it to be religion, that's fine too. Okay. But maybe it goes back to how we were just defining religion and philosophy just a few minutes ago, right? So basically, if it's just a set of ideas and that you don't really do anything, then it's philosophy. But if you're actually going to try to put these ideas in practice in your life, then it becomes more like religion. And if you're actually going to truly honor Confucius, and you're going to honor heaven, and you're going to honor your ancestors and all of this, then it's religion, right? So you can take Confucianism as a philosophy as you want, if you want, and you could take it as a religion if you want. And the same is the case for Taoism, where some people also think it's just like philosophy, and others talk about a religion, and some people say there's Dao Jia, which is not religious, and and there's Dao Jiao, which is religious. And again, the scholars are always debating about all this. But it's the same idea. You could take it religiously, or you could take it philosophically, and you could take it as a you could take both, right? And so here there's an interesting question that, well, what's in what ways do Confucianism and Taoism complement each other, and in what ways do they oppose each other? To my interpretation, Taoism may represent a higher standard as it requires more spiritual connections, which opposes the concept of Confucianism, talking about contribution and relationships with people. All right, well, what do you think? In what way do Confucianism and Taoism complement each other? In what way do they oppose each other? Most of you are Chinese, so how do you, you know something about Confucianism and Taoism? What's your view on that, on the comparison or relationships between Confucianism and Taoism? Any thoughts on that? All right, well, let me share some of one way of looking at this. Actually, it does tie in with what I mentioned in the earlier, actually, I think this past week, in the readings about the relationship between the political authority and religion. So, basically, this creates a tension between, so outside of China, you could say, this creates a tension within each religious tradition, because the political authority wants some kind of religion or some kind of sacredness, right? Some kind of sacred authority that can justify and legitimize the political authority, and also can tell people what is the proper form of social relationships that will be within the political authority. So in most countries, the political authority tries to use religion to establish this kind of sacred foundation of its political authority. And many religious people in the religious traditions, they think this is a great idea, because they consider that the social society needs some sacred foundation. So they're willing to help the political authority to establish this. But within each religious tradition, there are always those who think that that's not a good idea. That's very bad, right? And so they say, no, 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 right? I'm not going to join the political authority. And so in most traditions, then you have a tension between those who are, right, external orthodoxy aligned with the political authority. And then there are others who become more like distant from the political authority, and often very mystical. They're like, no, the true spirituality has got to be away from all of this politics and all of the political issues, and so it's actually inside of ourselves. And so so we should hide in caves, we should separate from society, separate from all these political issues, right? And so we have this kind of mystical approach in many religions, which is often about staying away from the political authority. And in China, it seems that in a sense, Confucianism represents the tendency that has been gone closer to the political authority, whereas Taoism is the tendency that tries to stay away from it, and so become more mystical or far from the political authority, which is to go among the people in the minjian, okay, among the common people. So in a sense, so this kind of represents this tension in Chinese culture. Confucianism represents a kind of religion that is associated with political authority, and Taoism represents a kind of religion that is, and actually sometimes even against political authority, right? Trying to stay far from political authority, and even sometimes opposing and rebellion against political authority. So in a sense, that's the difference. Yeah. Any thoughts on that? Okay. Yeah, and so this is one reason why in China, traditionally, obviously, the political authority supported Confucianism and made Confucianism into the official ideology, whereas traditionally, the political authority had more complicated relationship with Taoism. And even until today, actually. So actually, it was really interesting because once, so I've actually written a book about American practitioners of Taoism. So this is quite interesting. So you have Taoism, which is a Chinese tradition, which actually even many Chinese people don't understand very well and don't know very much. And then they were quite amazed that actually there's a lot of like Westerners who are actually really interested in Taoism and practicing kind of Taoist meditation and neidan and all of these different things, and interested, Chinese medicine and everything like that. And so this is a kind of an aspect of Chinese culture that is spreading overseas. Then I was at a conference in Shanghai a few years ago, and I talked about this project, about my book. And actually people were very excited about it because it's they said, wow, this is like Chinese soft power, right? It's 中国的软实力. So, they're quite excited about it. But then it actually became a bit of a problem, though, because so then some media, they kind of wanted to ask me, so how can China promote Taoism overseas? But the government has a very kind of complex relationship with Taoism. It's very hard for the government to promote Taoism overseas. So they have Confucius institutes, right? Not Lao Tzu institutes. And there's a reason for that. So yeah. And Taoism is very hard to control because it's very much about personal experience in the body and meditation and all of these different things. And so it's something that's harder to turn into a state, a kind of state controlled thing. Whereas Confucianism has always been very close to the political authority. So this is kind of so it's an interesting aspect of the relationship between Confucianism and Taoism. All right, so then let's go to Durkheim. Right, so earlier that question talked about Durkheim's definition of religion. And there were actually a few other questions that actually really, you didn't use Durkheim, but you actually really, what you were talking about was really exactly Durkheim's theory. So for example, here there was one of you wrote, within the reading in the last lecture, it mentions that God said that even the most powerful emperor in the world was nothing compared to him. However, is it possible that God doesn't exist? Is it possible that the source of the power of God is coming from his followers? So maybe God is only something created by our strong sense of belief. God is powerful because he lives in everybody's heart. People who believed in him could feel safe and warm. Neither be afraid nor worry about the bad things happening. As we believed, we had the power to fight against the most powerful emperor. As Moses believed, his determination could support him to save Israel. We believed that we were supported by God when we were doing something incredible. However, could it be something that we could do on our own? Maybe our determination and hard work are the ones who support us, but we don't believe it, so that we say that we are supported by God, which is supernatural. Thus, it makes sense that even something horrible happened to us, God will not help us as he doesn't exist. Okay, so basically, here's the idea, and this is exactly what Durkheim said. You know, he said, well, actually, the God is, in a sense, it's a projection of our own beliefs, and it's a projection of our own, the power of our own society. And so here I'm going to mention something that I developed with my co-instructor, Mike Brown, in my other course on science and religion, which really helps to understand this. And this is the idea of what we call ontological anti-realism. So basically, ontological realism says that something exists independently of our mind. So for example, this phone, it exists whether or not I know about the phone, and no matter what I think about the phone, it is there. And it will be there even if my own mind is not there. And it will be there even if I deny that it's there, and it will be there if I believe that it's there. So it exists completely independently of our own mind. So that's ontological realism. Now, actually, the idea of God, the Abrahamic God, is also, we could say it's an ontological realist idea. So the idea of the Abrahamic God, the God of Moses, is really that God exists no matter what we think about him. So God exists even if we don't believe in him. He exists if we believe in him. He exists even if we have wrong beliefs about him. So whatever, the existence of God has nothing to do with humans. And God will not change as humans' beliefs change. God is God, and God is always God. So this is an ontological realist idea. But then one could have an ontological anti-realist idea, which says that actually, so an anti-realist idea says that something does not exist separately from our own minds. So actually something can exist in our minds, but its existence is not independent of our own minds. So from an ontologically anti-realist perspective, you could say that, well, God exists in our mind. And so, yes, God is powerful, but he's powerful in our mind because we created him to be powerful. In our own mind, we made him, we imagined God, and then we empowered God to give us power, right? So this is an ontologically anti-realist position. And Durkheim, and this question here, represents an ontologically anti-realist idea. So this is one possible explanation for the power of God, right? That yes, God made the people of the Hebrew people, gave them courage and gave them hope because God was in their minds, was in their heart, but actually God is their own imagination and nothing more than their own imagination. So this is an ontologically anti-realist position. Now, another question was, it was very similar. So in reading 11.1, it is said that God and religious teachings empowered and inspired people to step back from their society and religious practices. It implied that God empowered us. However, if the African man mentioned in the reading could empower his God and give faith to his God, he would have had a God that was everywhere. therefore, it seems that it is the people who empowered God rather than God who empowered the people. So which way did the power come from, or was it bilateral? Okay, so here's an interesting question. So here you're saying, well, okay, so this African man, the God of his imagination was very limited. So he was afraid to leave his village because his God was too weak. So why not just let him imagine a more powerful God, and then he would be okay, right? So it's a problem of his own imagination. So give him a more powerful imaginary God, and then he'll be fine. And then he could take that imaginary God with him when he travels further. So, okay, so why not? Actually, this is a very good question. But what's so interesting is actually that's not exactly how things happened. So actually, the African people, they didn't have that kind of an imagination of an all-powerful God until somebody came and brought it to them. So in other words, they had very weak, we could say, very weak gods, local gods. And then, we had Christians came, and we had Muslims came, and we had Baha'is came, and then they told him about this much more powerful God. So actually, it's funny, like for an entire continent, and this was the same everywhere, right? Actually, people were unable to imagine such a God. It always, somebody told them about it. And actually, for now, the story of Moses is also that they kind of knew about this God, but they didn't know about his power, and they didn't believe in his power. So then the story is that God, like, literally, revealed himself to Moses in the burning bush, right? And Moses didn't believe it. He says, who are we? We're just slaves. We're just poor people. We have no power. And so it was this voice that told Moses from outside. He said, you can do it. I will make you do it. And so from a small number of revelations, then this idea spread. So people who didn't have this imagination, through this revelation, through the teachings of Moses and other prophets, then this idea of an all-powerful God came into their mind, was introduced into their mindscape, so to speak. So it's very similar. So if you look at the history of these axial figures, okay, so each of these axial figures brought something, a new revelation, or a new idea of the ultimate reality that was bigger and greater and more transcendental than before. And this happened actually relatively few times. Okay, I mentioned a few axial figures, and there were others, but it's not like everywhere around the world people are just imagining, the absolute reality the way Buddhist does, or the transcendental God, or things like that. Actually, this idea only appears in a few places. So there's a revelation, and for those figures, that revelation came from outside them. Literally, God spoke to Moses. Or that's the story. I mean, you could believe it or you don't believe it, but that's the way it's understood, right? Or Buddha, okay, in the story of Buddha, it's not like somebody came and spoke to him, but he was under the tree, and then it's like this receptive imagination that I talked about earlier in the class. It's suddenly the knowledge of the ultimate reality, the complete knowledge of the ultimate reality just poof appears to him. So it's not like he was thinking about it. How do I imagine a better reality? No. It's like poof, it's like bam, dun wu, and there it is. Okay. So somehow it came from somewhere else, not from his own mental, intellectual thinking, or from his own active, projective imagination, right? Or even his creative imagination. It's not coming from the creative imagination or the projective imagination. It's just literally coming in. So this idea that it's coming in, that supports the ontological realist idea, that there is a reality, an ultimate reality that exists independently of human beings. So no matter what we think about it, there is an ultimate reality out there. And sometimes that ultimate reality is revealed to human beings. Um, and then when it is revealed, if we then look at the history of religions, that allows, like, so a new idea, a new concept, new teachings, and that expands the imagination. That expands our world of imagination to something much greater than we'd ever imagined ever before. So that's why my view is a mixture of ontological realism and anti-realism. And this helps to explain, we had a lot of discussion about this earlier when we were talking about the mindscape and empowering the objects of consciousness, right? So in my view, there is an ultimate reality that exists completely independent of human imagination. And there are times when the ultimate reality, which we call God in the Abrahamic religious traditions, has other names, other traditions. There are times when this ultimate reality kind of is revealed to humans. But after it's revealed, then we imagine it. So it comes into our imagination, and then we start doing all kinds of things with it in our own mindscape. So then we empower it or we don't, right? It can be revealed and we don't want to think about it, right? So it can be there in our mindscape. Oh, we heard about God, or we heard about Buddha or whatever, but then we don't, we don't give it any, we don't empower it. Or we empower, we say yes, and so in my belief and my worship and so on, I let that power affect me, right? So in a sense, so it's really what, in this question, I think it is bilateral. So you asked, which way did the power come from, or was it bilateral? And I think it's a bilateral process, okay? That's my understanding. It's a bilateral process. It's not completely the product of our imagination, but it's not completely external. So whatever you get from religion is never something completely pure, right? It's always mediated by human languages, human cultures, and things like that. So it's never completely pure either. All right, we're already running out of time here. So yeah, I think that's about it. There are other questions that I'll actually deal with next week, because the remaining questions are actually related to the readings of this week. And so I'll end now. Before we move on to the videos, are there any questions or comments on the things that I have just said?